Hello, my name's Rob Shaw. I'm a bit of a geek for London history, and this is a presentation about what I found out about Freemasonry in London. If you've been watching the other videos, you'll know that I started off by being fascinated with Nicholas Hawksmoor, and his work plays a big role in my understanding of all of this, such as it is. But I thought it's really interesting to me, and it's kind of like in astronomy, sometimes they work out that there's something there by how that thing interacts with everything else. Even though they can't see it, they kind of know it's there. So there's something like that I'm going to present to you here. There's this sort of, I think, piece of information that's sort of been removed from my history, but you can still see the sort of shadows and consequences of it. So this is Freemasonry in London. Free the Masons, because everyone knows they're right up there on the list of people who need help. So first of all, thought I'd start with this. Good things about Freemasonry. I mean this in the broadest possible sense, like Masons who were free to go around and build stuff in the Middle Ages. They made all these amazing Gothic cathedrals, of which there are dozens. And, you know, I'd have no respect for anyone who doesn't think these are a good thing. These are amazing. I mean, you could argue the time and effort that was taken on building these things, you could have built other things, fair enough. But I just think, I mean, for me, ever since I was a kid, been blown away by these Gothic cathedrals. I just think they're amazing. So that for me is part one. Good things about Freemasonry is they made cathedrals, and this is, we'll get back to the history of this, but certainly there was an incredible breakout of this architectural style starting 12th century in Europe, and you can see where it's centered. I defy anyone to say these aren't amazing buildings. They still stand 1,000 years later. They're absolutely amazing. Good thing about Freemasonry. Another good thing about Freemasonry, from my point of view, is their involvement. It seems Freemasonry and Freemasons' involvement in revolutions, specifically, you got George Washington there on the left. Lots of people involved in the American War of Independence were Freemasons, and so apparently were people involved in the French Revolution. You know, the whole sort of thrust of this thinking, this philosophy, is sort of liberty, equality and fraternity. It's kind of based on a notion of people being equal, which is, you know, in complete contrast to their people living in a hierarchy with a king and then dukes and then counts and barons and so on. Liberty, equality and fraternity, this idea that everyone's equal, everyone gets a vote, everyone's got a right to participate equally. These things were fought and died for by Freemasons in America and France. They, from my point of view, represented definitely an improvement on the old divine right of kingship setup. So yeah, good things about Freemasonry too. They helped move us towards a fairer society, democracy, equality. Another good thing about Freemasonry, you could say, is in a lot of ways, you could say it was about personal development, kind of like how, you know, people might get into yoga, that's a good thing, or I don't know, there are all these spiritual practices, and could even go astrology because of all the different things you learn, even though all of it's not necessarily factual. The fact you learn so many facts about astrology and can keep all these things in your head kind of exercises your brain. So something about Freemasonry, you could say, is it certainly claims to help personal development. The little quote there, Freemasonry is founded on the immutable laws of truth and justice, and its grand object is to promote the happiness of the human race. That's George Washington, and, you know, you could say whatever you want about that statement. I'm not advocating for it, but he certainly seemed to believe in something that made him want to fight for a better place. You know, even though he wasn't a great guy or perfect human being, he was a slave owner and all that sort of stuff. He did believe in something that was, in my opinion, better than just being a subject to a hierarchy. He wanted more freedom for people, more equality, rather than, and fought to defend that idea. So anyway, good things about Freemasonry. 3, personal development. There's also, I just caught this off the web, you know, just some, I think I put Masonic quote: speak with honesty, think with sincerity, act with integrity. It sounds like the Boy Scouts, doesn't it? I mean, it's some kind of personal moral development kind of hierarchy or system. And we'll talk about that a little bit because I do understand a little bit about it in sort of principle, but you can see that I got this thing of the staircase, no idea about the details of it, but the idea is, again, you make progress. You start off as an initiate, like you would in any system, and you become eventually a master, having learned, like you could in Kung Fu or anything else. So good things about Freemasonry Part 3, personal development. This is Inigo Jones, and he was undoubtedly a Freemason of some sort. And I'll just quickly tell you about him, because you could speculate ad infinitum about what Freemasons may or may not get up to, right? You know, up to and including shape-shifting lizards and anything you want. Inigo Jones is definitely real. So we can talk about that, you know, in the same way we could talk about any other historical figure and kind of demystify the whole Freemasonry thing by keeping it real. So he was born in London to Welsh-speaking parents. It's always interesting to me to know that people were still speaking British. We call it Welsh now, but still speaking the British language that predated English in London in the 16th century. It's just something, as a Londoner, that's, you know, and as an Englishman, I just was never aware of quite how widespread still the British language, the pre-English language, was in England and in London. So Inigo Jones, British Welsh family. When he was about 30, for some reason he visited Venice, and that's not something everyone got to do. To get a passport was difficult, let alone go to Venice, check out all the lovely architecture there. And specifically the style of architecture in Venice, Palladian, was influenced by the work of a Roman architect called Vitruvius, all about proportion and harmony, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But certainly for the cloth maker's son, he somehow got to Venice, did all this incredible artwork, it seems, learnt about Vitruvius, who was basically news, brand new information to the English, and he was the first person to bring it back, that Vitruvian Palladian style. Talk about that. He was obviously already skilled, because in 1604, the year after he'd been to Venice, he helped design in Denmark these two castles called Rosenborg and Frederiksborg. And as I hope you can see, neither of those, they're on the right there, neither of those are very small. I mean, that's that can't have been his first architectural gig. Before going to Venice, he'd achieved quite a lot, went to Venice, maybe got some kind of training there, and came back and started designing castles for the King of Denmark. In 1615, became the surveyor of the King's works, a role that later Sir Christopher Wren would hold. And Wren, I might as well mention this now, hated Inigo Jones. Inigo Jones, I was going to swear, Inigo Jones was not Christopher Wren's favourite guy. Everything he stood for, Jones was, and we'll see in detail about this, Wren rejected, almost sort of like an allergic response to Inigo Jones. He hated Inigo Jones, surveyor of King's work. And one of the things he hated most in London was this. It's an illustration in black and white. This is the west end of the old St. Paul's Cathedral that Jones remade for Charles I in 1630. Christopher Wren hated this with a passion. And we'll see that he was very quick to destroy it later. There's a real venom for this Palladian style. I don't know if you can see all these columns, very nicely ordered, quite plain, quite austere looking. Next year, Inigo Jones made the first Protestant parish church, and that was in Covent Garden. The guy who wanted Covent Garden built wanted it built like an Italian piazza. Probably the only person in England who'd been to Italy, if you know what I mean, was Inigo Jones. So anyway, Inigo Jones created an Italian piazza in Covent Garden, and as part of that, he had to build St. Paul's Church. And this is how it looks: very plain, very ordered, quite austere. That's the kind of Palladian style. It's quite a odd-looking church, to be fair. Apparently, he had to build it on the cheap, but it's still there. And for anyone who lives in London, everyone knows how great Covent Garden is, and I don't know why we don't have more piazza, but I'm glad we got one, and thank you, Inigo Jones. Really last nice detail is that in 1633, he just declined a knighthood. There are a few people I know of who I think are cool who have declined knighthoods, and I always think they're cooler for having done it. It says something about maybe his values. For example, Michael Faraday, the Ed scientist many years later declined a knighthood because he said it went against his feelings of equality, his Christian values. So Indigo Jones felt the same way. He felt in some deep way we're all equals, and on that basis says, no, I don't want a knighthood that sets me apart from people. The other things happened in his life, but in 1652 he died. But that's a quick overview of Indigo Jones, recognised as being the first real architect in England, first person really to be called that, someone who really knew the science of building in a new, deeper, more profound way. And we'll get to a little bit of that in a minute. The reason why it's pretty clear Indigo Jones was a Freemason is because there is a big tradition of his name associated with Freemasonry. And this is what's called the Igo Jones Charge. Now, I'm going to show you all of this. It's quite long, and mainly the reason for showing you all is just to show you how long it is. We're not going to read it all, but I just wanted to point out, sort of at the bottom of the second paragraph in this charge, Masonry is called a curious science. So I've put that in bold there, but you can see it begins with a sort of prayer, the might of the Father of Heaven, yada, 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 Christian, starts talking about Masonry and Masons. And I'm just going to skip through this. Anyone who's interested is more than welcome to pause it and have a look. But this is what's called a charge, and this would have been read out when the Masons got together. Read out. Here it talks about the 7 liberal arts and how geometry is probably the most important of those liberal arts, at least according to this. This is now a history of those sciences or those arts and how they were applied. This goes from Noah all the way to Euclid, who in geometry terms was almost like Jesus. Euclid was the Jesus of geometry, if you like. He was certainly important. This is Euclid's charge. This is Euclid sort of saying, oh, hey, Masons, if you want to be a Mason, this is how you got to do it, sort of thing. Another bit of history. This is now roughly from the time of King Solomon and the stuff that Masons built for him all the way up to Trajan. And he had a column that is still celebrated. And it celebrates the fact that Masons' work lasts an awfully long time. Then it reaches Christian era, starting with St. Alban and the history of Masonry really in England, you could say, and up to 1432, where it was in the 15th century rather that the Worshipful Company of Masons got its privileges in London. So this is still a history of Masonry. And lastly, these are the modern charges. This is the sort of stuff you can see. It says first, blah, blah, blah. Second, list of responsibilities you were supposed to discharge. Reason for showing you all of that and skipping through all of that is just to show you roughly, that's a lot of words. I think it's about 5,000 words. The last sentence is the one I wanted to show you because it kind of, I think, shows you what was going on here. These charges that we have now rehearsed unto you and all other that belong to Masons ye shall keep. Now, we have rehearsed unto you. That means in the room or wherever they met in the lodge, someone would have spoken this from memory. These charges we have now read to you. People were doing this from memory. I imagine that you'd start off learning the first bit, which is, oh, Father, where art thou, or whatever, that simple bit. You'd rehearse that, and that would be your bit as the new, as a new guy, neophyte, whatever, to say that bit out loud. And as the story went on, people would take bigger and bigger chunks until someone maybe said all of this, or bigger and bigger chunks. But the point would be that within that group of people, that group of Masons, they could recite this whole thing, about 4,000 words, either individually or between them, or in different combinations and permutations. I don't know. But now we have rehearsed unto you all that other that belong to Masons ye shall keep. That's your job, part of your responsibilities as a member of the club, to internalize this. It's an awful lot, 4,000 words, but I looked it up. Hamlet is the part that the actor has to play if they're doing the whole thing is 30,000 words. So it's a big ask, this. I don't know if you've ever had to learn any words, lyrics and so on. It is difficult. Certainly I've had to do it. It's not easy. Trying to remember 4,000 words looks very daunting, but I just sort of put it in context, because like Ian McKellen, that actor, I think he's 18, he's doing Hamlet, or has just done Hamlet. So it isn't impossible. It's just a lot of work. That's the Indigo Jones Charge, and that's clearly associated with him and his work. Some people say it was written about the first decade of the 17th century, 1605, 1609, something like this. The Indigo Jones Charge, it had something to do with him and connected with his brother Masons, the people I guess he built with. This Palladian architecture was brought by Igo Jones to London. The building on the left is actually in Italy, in North Italy somewhere, and building on the right isn't by Jones, but that's Chiswick House in West London, and it was built by people who were very much influenced by Palladian architecture. So you can see literally one thing being sort of transplanted into Britain. So this is the mark of Igo Jones. This is the Palladian architecture, very much influenced by the 10 books on architecture by Vitruvius. I didn't know anything about any of that until I came across this building that Hawksmoor worked on. This is actually designed by Igo Jones. It's called the Queen's House. It's in Greenwich, and it was originally designed for Queen Anne of Denmark, who was the wife of James I. The building's quite weird because it's actually built over a road. And if you go inside this bit we're looking at, it's kind of like the building from the top down looks like an H. It's 2 blocks with a join in between. This block was the Queen's apartments. There was a single corridor over to the other apartment, and that was the King's apartments. And they actually lived on opposite sides of the road. So although the building looks like one single building, it's actually 2 separate apartments, which is pretty much an architectural analogue of James and Anne's marriage, because they hated each other. James preferred men, and Anne had her parties, James had his parties. So this building was built, initially designed by Jones to house a very unhappy couple, which is why it was built, they say, over a road. Igo Jones built this. You can see the regularity of the shape of it. Later, Hawksmoor and his boss, Wren, were asked to come to Greenwich and sort out a naval hospital. This building was already there, and they had to build everything else around it, which again, it was Igo Jones' building, and Wren absolutely hated that. Hawksmoor added a couple of things to this house, or this building, that I think are worth pointing out, because whilst Jones was in favour of Palladian architecture, Wren, and therefore Hawksmoor, were into what's called Baroque, and a Baroque is essentially a lot more flowery and ornate. Now, on the sort of ground floor, you can see those keystones above the windows. I'm pointing at the screen like it's helping anyone. I know what I'm talking about. And they're these keystones that don't need to be there. They're an addition. They're a Baroque decoration. Also, this staircase with sort of sub-basement door there, that wasn't there either. That's a Hawksmoor addition as well. The sort of decorative touches Hawksmoor put on this place, some people said were people who liked Palladian architecture, and we'll talk about who they are in a minute, said what Hawksmoor did sort of pimped up this house building and didn't make it very nice, didn't like it. And again, I was just, when I was first learning about Hawksmoor, I was like, okay, here's a guy, he's an architect. Why the hell did people have such strong opinions about staircases and keystones and stuff? I really didn't get it. Hawksmoor and Wren were really trying to do something different to the Palladian architecture. It became clear that this was part of a bigger picture, but today we're talking about this sort of building masonry part of this picture. Here's Greenwich Naval Hospital, absolutely amazing, huge site, most of it designed by Wren, all the rest of it pretty much by Hawksmoor, and Hawksmoor was pretty much responsible for the whole site. It's a World Heritage site. It's absolutely amazing, and this is a great shot for a couple of reasons. You can see the Queen's house in the background, right in the middle there. Queen Anne, when she had the house, said she wanted it eventually, because there had been buildings in between the Queen's house and the river. She said she wanted eventually to be able to see the river from the Queen's house. Now, she was long dead, but for reasons of etiquette or whatever, that wish was still granted. So you can see the Queen's house has a perfect view all the way through the building. And if you look at it, it's quite kind of white and plain. Now, that's Palladian. What you're looking at either side is much more Baroque. This is much more Wren. It's much more decorative, lots more features in many more decorative features. You could put it like that. For me, what was useful when I first came across this Baroque. This looks much more like Paris to me. Greenwich Naval Hospital was built by Wren as a Baroque complex. he hated the fact that right in the middle of it was the Queen's house that was made by Indigo Jones. What I want to show you now is just, you can see how symmetrical the whole setup is. If you look at the Queen's house, everything is either side of those central windows. And if you actually look above on the hill, there's that picture of that general who killed some people in Canada, I think, looking out. Anyway, this is all built on a perfect line of symmetry. And actually what Hawksmoor did later was he extended that line of symmetry all the way over the Isle of Dogs. And in Limehouse, he built a church in 1711 called St. Anne's. You can see I've sort of drawn the arrow across the line of symmetry on the map there. That's St. Anne's church there. It's a really massive church and completely overwhelms its surroundings, and certainly did at the time. Unfortunately, you can't see Greenwich Hill there because now they've got Canary Wharf in the way. But I found this old picture from the top of Greenwich Hill, and if you look plumb down that line of symmetry, you'll see where that arrow is pointing is St. Anne's. And so this is part of Hawksmoor's legacy. He built on top of the legacy of Wren, and he lined up St. Anne's with the central axis that was all built around this Queen's house that was built by Igo Jones that Wren hated. Part of Wren's frustration that he expressed for the rest of his life, he literally called architecture rubbish. He was very bitter about it all. It's because he never got to the chance to build a Baroque city. That's what he thought he was going to do. He thought he was going to build a Paris of the North, or, a Florence of the North, you might say. And we've talked a lot about the 18th of September and why that never happened. This is the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. It is what they call a trompe d'oeil, triumph of the eye, or something like that it translates as. And that's literally a feature of Baroque architecture. It's the deliberate way to sort of overwhelm the senses. The idea is the building, the experience is overwhelming. And if you've ever gone to St. Paul's and looked up at the dome, it certainly is very impressive. And it does achieve that effect. It gives you that kind of dizzying, overwhelmed effect. And this is very much how Wren thought one should feel about God. Like God was overwhelming, God was all powerful, and you should do absolutely what what you're told. So yeah, Wren almost got to build after 1666 a whole city in this Baroque style that I just showed you at Greenwich. That would have made London very, very different to how it is now. I showed you the west portico that Indigo Jones built of the old St. Paul's earlier. When the old St. Paul's got destroyed in the fire London, some of the west portico wasn't completely damaged, and people were talking about using Jones's work or that bit of the church to build on, and so on. So Wren and his friend Hook just basically blew it up. They're in the habit of going to meetings with people and planning things out, and these people saying, "Oh, you've got to go this, do this, this, and this," and them just then just going and doing whatever the hell they wanted, and it being too late for anyone to do anything. The actual St. Paul's Cathedral we've got was not what the people who paid for it signed off on. They signed off on a very different church, and Wren was like, well, I'm going to do it my way, and by the time I've done it, it's going to be too late for you to do anything about it. They dismantled and used all of Indigo Jones' west portico, that bit that some people had wanted to save, and used it as the foundations. They literally ground it into dust, sort of thing, and pounded it in as the foundations for Wren's St. Paul's Cathedral. And Wren was very happy that day that he managed to destroy and bury the work of Indigo Jones. For those of you who've seen these other videos, this sort of breakdown is probably familiar now, Whigs versus Tory, but in this context, you've got the Whig kind of leaning architect in Indigo Jones and the Tory in Sir Christopher Wren. This is meant to be, I'm getting to now the bit where it's more explicitly about Freemasonry, but you can see there are clear alignments I've made here. It is true to say the Whigs favoured and advocated this Palladian architecture, and the Tories favoured Baroque. Also, we'll see that there's a clear distinction between what are called the Irish Rite and the Scottish Rite in Freemasonry. Now, the Scottish Rite is, as we'll see, associated with Stuarts, who were the kings of Scotland before the kings of Great Britain. That was called the Scottish Rite by them. The Irish Rite, as a title, is intriguing because there's not really, I mean, there's stone buildings in Ireland, so there is a tradition of Irish masonry, but the reason for it being called Irish, it was more kind of like it was a pejorative. You've got the inferior kind of Masonry, sort of English racism about Ireland, they're all being stupid potato eaters and all of this sort of thing, that it was somehow quite a pejorative way of describing this rite. For me, it seems clear that it's probably more likely Welsh, or what you could broadly call British, and the people around the Tories and the Stuarts just wanted to make it sound as common and beneath the pale as possible, because that's what they were about. That's what they were doing to it. That's what they're about in every way. So Irish Rite, Scottish Rite, it's what they're referred to broadly today, and I'm going to stick with that, but without only having clarified that Irish Rite is a bit of more of a label that other people put on this than they did themselves. So I wanted to show you this guy as an example of, or the example of, Scottish Rite Freemasonry in England, because this guy, Robert Murray, is certainly a very interesting guy. He was a Scotsman. He went over to France to fight. He was a soldier, and eventually became a spy, an agent, whatever you want to call it, for Cardinal Richelieu, who, you know, I heard of because of, you know, D'Artagnan and all of that sort of thing. There was also a guy, I think, called Mazarin, who was before Richelieu, and I think Murray worked for him as well. You get it. He was working for the French state, and the guy who was pretty much the French state. I mean, the top of the chain, Cardinal Richelieu in France, he was in charge of, there was nothing he wasn't allowed to touch. He was the state. So Robert Murray, working for Cardinal Richelieu, the Scots started rebelling against Charles I in what was called, this is the beginning of the English Civil Wars. Charles I had tried to impose bishops on the Scottish Church. They were having none of it. So they had what were called the Bishops' Wars. And to probably try and work out what was going on, Richelieu, or his predecessor, sent Robert Murray back to Scotland and, you know, go and mix it up and go and report to the French about what's going to happen. Now, Charles I was completely unsuccessful in trying to impose his will on the Scots, and the English ragtag of an army that was all based around the loyalties of people in the Order of the Garter in some kind of medieval throwback were chased out of Scotland, and the Scots army, that they had their swords on, decided to push on down to Newcastle upon Tyne and probably, you know, lay siege to the place, shake them down for a bit of money before they go home. It was at this point that Robert Murray became the first person to be initiated into Scottish Rite Freemasonry in England. And that happened on the 20th of May, 1641. That's just a matter of record. Murray continues to be an interesting fella, because in 1651, by this time, Charles I had been executed, and Charles II, the future Charles II, his son, was in France, hiding from Cromwell. His family were in exile. Robert Murray persuaded Charles to sail up to Scotland and get crowned at Scone, the traditional place for the kings of Scotland to be crowned. And that's actually what they did. They stole up to Scotland, and Charles was crowned at Scone, and he sort of walked down the country trying to get loyalists to follow him and take over the country and revenge his father, who'd been killed a couple of years before. But actually, Charles and Murray were defeated at the Battle of Worcester, which is the 3rd of September, 1651. And as a result of that, had to flee the country. The future Charles II, who was now King of Scotland, actually had to shave his head and dress up as a washerwoman in order to be able to sneak onto a boat and get across to France. Later, after many years of exile, Charles Stuart comes back, gets crowned Charles II. At his restoration, pretty much after his restoration, sets up the Royal Society. Robert Murray is the first president of the Royal Society, that scientific body that's still going today. He was also acknowledged to be, at least initially, the chief courtier to Charles II. So there's a guy with strong Scottish and French connections, and very strong French connections. It seems like the French were paying Robert Murray his whole career. And this is a guy who became the first person to be initiated into the Scottish Rite. If you haven't seen the other videos, this makes him absolutely a Tory, because he's so bound up with the Stuarts. On the other side, and this is where we start talking about those things that maybe you see the shadows of, but you never see for real in our history, because throughout the run-up to the Civil War and afterwards, people were incredibly politically active. And I want to point out that these people were working in concert or had all kinds of operations going on that seemed very, very, very much like the same operations that later happened in France in their revolution and during the American Revolution. There are people agitating on exactly the same kind of basis. And one absolute standout example of this is this guy called John Lilburn, who is someone everyone in England and everyone in America should learn about because of what he did. But we don't, and that's because our history is written by Tories. He's sort of famously known as Freeborn John. And what he did was he became the absolute standout advocate for people having rights at birth, not because the king had given them, but because they were God-given. God made me free, gave me the right to try and earn a living. God gave me the sort of, freedom, justice, and pursuit of happiness. That notion didn't start with him, but he became its most famous advocate. His opinions in the run-up to and during and after the English Civil War have been cited by the US Supreme Court as a reason for doing things. Incredibly influential. You'll see he was quite a character. In the 1630s, so before the Civil War, he had to run off to Holland to escape persecution from the very, very conservative William Laud, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury for Charles I. He came back during the Civil War and fought at the Battle of Brentford. He actually made an amazing speech. The Royalists were charging in on horses, as they were wont to do. The infantry of the parliamentarians at Brentford were kind of a bit shaky, and he apparently rallied them, managed to get them to go back and not win the day, but not completely lose either. He was captured and taken prisoner to Oxford, where he debated and sort of refuted the king in all kinds of terms of legalities and who owed what to whom. Apparently he was sentenced to death, but his wife came up with a letter saying, look, if you kill my John Lilburn, then minor nobility, the parliamentarians had caught, that would be killed if he was killed. So there's actually an exchange of prisoners, and he managed to have some kind of debate and face down with King Charles and get away with it, which made him a bit of a hero to all the people who didn't like the king. Later, he angered the Earl of Manchester because he noticed a particular castle was looking vulnerable. He said, let's go and take it. The Earl of Manchester said no, and he said, no, I'll go and take it anyway. He wasn't afraid of using his own initiative, and he was quite a disruptive influence. He didn't defer to anyone gladly. He was a bit of an agitator, and at that, taking a whole castle for your side and your commanding officer or whatever being angry with you because you took a castle is quite an interesting reflection on his character. He was also a pamphleteer, did a lot of writing. That's principally how his opinions, have become so influential. A particular pamphlet that everyone in this country should read, really short. It's kind of like a Civil War Communist Manifesto, a very punchy little document that gets the ideas across, called An Agreement for the People, just saying about the type of government these people were fighting for. If we were going to go and fight in this civil war to get rid of the king, what we're going to have in exchange. And really famously in Putney in 1645, loads of members of the army, after they'd pretty much won the war on the battlefield, these soldiers are now taking it to the next step and saying, well, what kind of constitution, what kind of country are we going to have? There's an American justice called Hugo Black who said Lilburn's writings in 1649, just that year as he contributed to the debates and all of this stuff was going on, you can derive the entire US Constitution and Bill of Rights from that. And you can say what you want about America today and so on, but having a Bill of Rights was progress, certainly at the time. And John Lilburn would be able to point out to you the scars on his body why that was the case. Yeah, interestingly, as well as having to flee from persecution from the sort of conservative wing of the Church of England when Charles I was in charge, he also had to flee from the Puritans when Cromwell was in charge. He was for freedom of religion. He didn't like anyone telling anyone how to worship, whether it be the Puritans or anyone else. And he always advocated for, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and equal rights. So this guy, John Lilburn, historical character, fought and lived and died for all of these kind of values. And it's really interesting to me that him and his are written out of our history. The Levellers, or more, let's go to the New Model Army. Now, the New Model Army was exactly that. It was a new model, because for forever, what the royalists or the aristocrats have done, whenever there was trouble, they'd ride in on their horseback, shoot a couple of muskets if they were around or whatever, but ride in on horseback and basically charge into the rabble, disperse them, and people, maybe with pitchforks, would see that they were being outgunned by a mounted cavalry with superior weaponry and so on. That would always been the case. Whenever there was trouble, you'd send the horses in, you'd send the gentlemen in on horseback who'd break things up. So Cromwell identified what he needed for his new model army was people with what he sort of called moral courage, people who were willing to stand and fight and believe in what they were fighting for, not just turn up because there was a penny in it. That's what he sort of recruited for, and that's what he got. Famously, the pikemen here of the new model army stood firm and would repel these cavalry charges, and it just left the Cavaliers, you know, the royal side of the army, was very confused, because it's like, oh, that's never happened before, kind of thing. And they had no other tactics. They had no other way of going about it other than to, bloody hell, let's try that, you know. And literally the new model army's discipline and courage just saw them off, and it was the end of an era. That was the end of the aristocracy. They could no longer charge at people with horses. So the new model army was very successful. They were very well trained, and they were talking to each other. They were talking to each other about what they were fighting for broadly, right? They wanted more equality. Why wouldn't you, especially if you were on the bottom half of society? More votes for all. Some people advocated for votes for women. Some people advocated for equal property rights. Like, why should one guy have 10,000 acres and I only get 10 or whatever? They advocated for the end of the aristocracy, you know, different people at different times. And they developed nearly all the ideas that foreshadow the United States of America and all these other republics that don't have this inbuilt hierarchy. And as you can imagine, all of this absolutely terrified not only the royalists, who they defeated in battle, but then once the fighting was over, the Puritans and the city folk who were well-to-do and had an investment in the status quo were terrified by them. They were like a genie that had been let out of the bottle. The new model army definitely exists, and some people called people who advocated for equality levelers. So it's a term that was out there at the time. Another thing that was going on at the time was this. In the city of London, there were what called the Coleman Street presses. Coleman Street is this area of the city, it's a ward of the city in red in that little map there. It's right by the Guildhall that I've put that gold star on, right in the heart of the city, and a hotbed of activity before, during, and after the Civil War. And specifically, I want to talk about what they got up to after the Civil War, because it shows there was an organization here. It's, again, you'll see hundreds of different pamphlets were made lobbying on very specific issues in a very quick turnaround. And people say this wasn't organized. I'm trying to show you that it was. There was some kind of organization based around Coleman Street that operated very effectively. What they'd do is they'd identify an issue that was being debated in Parliament. They create pamphlets that would be very memey, maybe a couple of rhymes and a picture, and explain the issue in popular terms. And they get people to, you know, leave space or ask people to sign a petition on one motion or another to do with this particular bit of legislation. These would then get printed out in hundreds and distributed through coaching routes. I've left this map up. I can't speak to coaching routes and all of that kind of thing. I'm not an expert, but you bang a whole load of copies of this stuff on the back of a coach and shoot off to different towns. They get distributed in the different towns. The coach, I guess, would go to the end of its route, spend a couple of days there, and then come back. And as it came back, the same guy would collect all the petitions in. And this meant in no time, relatively speaking to the 17th century, that you had thousands of signatures petitioning on a particular issue at a time where you were in, you know, uncharted waters, in that there was no king anymore. Parliament was in charge and they were trying to work out what to do. This system that went on and on and on, and John Lilburn was famously involved in this, and there are other figures involved in this, we'll talk about another one in a minute, was leveraging politics in a way that had never happened before, maybe in any modern, in any country before. I think you could probably say that, because No one had ever had this situation before. Several times people tried, both on the, before the Civil War, people tried to find these Coleman Street presses. Maybe they found one or two and never stopped the operation. Later on, the city authorities tried to shut them down, never stopped the operation. After Cromwell got in, sometimes they were no one could stop this operation happening. It seemed like there were a network of people dedicated to this operation, well organized, well resourced, able to do this for years, and lobbying. And again, we don't get taught that this happened. We get taught, oh, people printed pamphlets. It was concerted. People were trying to improve the lot of the common man in a way that had never been tried before. So this is me pointing out, first of all, lots of historians say today the Levellers didn't exist as a political entity or party. I'm saying that I think they did. I mean, whether they all had a little form they filled in is irrelevant. They existed as a political movement. There was a network that agitated for radical change and equality over years. And again, our history now is no, that didn't exist. That's kind of the point. You see all these things happening and we're told, oh, there was all these sort of spider webs, but no spider in the middle. There was something going on. There was some kind of organization, however loose, that they were part of, and they shared values. Time and again, you'll hear mention of apron youths in the city who wear sea green aprons. Their color was sea green. They'd also Levellers would wear sea green ribbons. And it was their color, it was their signification, their way of identifying themselves. But there's dozens of mentions of apron youths and the better sort of brethren and sea green ribbons. It's a way of showing your affiliation to this movement, which, was a much more coherent movement than the Whigs or the Tories at the time. And for all intents and purposes, I think was probably the first political party, in a modern sense in this country. Now, I want to talk to you about this particular instance, the funeral of a guy called Thomas Rainsborough, who, like John Lilburn, was a famously always called Leveller, wanted equality. He was actually killed by a bunch of royalists who were raiding the country in 1648, just before the end of the Civil War, you could say. So Rainsborough was killed by a bunch of royalists who were just out stealing things, really, and he became a martyr. So when his funeral happened back in London, there were thousands of aproned youths. People would decorate themselves in ways I can't really find, certainly on Google image search. It's not easy to identify apron youths of the city, or I'd show you a picture, but you see it written an awful lot. I've seen it written a lot, and people talk about the better sort of brethren, all these fraternal things that just sound like masonry, like with the apron and so on. I want to read you this because this is what Thomas Rainsborough said one of the things he said during the Putney debates a few years before he got killed. It's a really nice example of what they were advocating for. He was saying, but would I fain know what the soldier hath fought for all this while? He hath fought to enslave himself, to give power to men of riches, men of estates, to make him a perpetual slave. When these gentlemen fall out among themselves, they shall press the poor scrubs to come and kill each other for them. They're saying, like, what did we soldiers fight for if we're coming back, after the Civil War, that we've got no greater stake in the country than we did do beforehand? That's Thomas Rainsborough. His funeral was a big event for the apron youths of the city, and connection between aprons and masonry is well established. And it's worth pointing out that the Worshipful Company of Masons was instituted at least since 1472, and they wore aprons as well. And so it seems like some kind of, let's just say, aprons were a common factor. All these people were kind of Whig-leaning. They were anti-royalist. They lived in the city. They lived cheek by jowl. They were very much new people not living in the ancient way of, the agrarian subsistence way. They were new, forward-thinking, maybe modern is the better way of putting it. Modern, for the era, they were modern thinkers. And this Worshipful Company of Masons had a monopoly on building in the City of London. Within the walled City of London, they were the only people who were allowed to build. And they were Whigs. I've shown this quote before. It's an amazing quote. This is, again, Nicholas Hawksmoor, talking about, and this was in the 1670s, he was not even, was 5 when the Great Fire of London happened, and it always intrigued me why he got so angry about the Great Fire of London 50 years later. He said, a convenient and regular, well-built city, excellent, skillful, honest artificers made by the greatness and quantity of the work in rebuilding such a capital. So you're getting all these people in, honest artificers, to come in and rebuild a city in stone. But instead of these, we have no city, nor streets, nor houses, but a chaos of dirty treads, always tumbling or taking fire, winding crooked passages, lakes of mud, rills of stinking mire running through them. He wasn't happy. The opportunity to rebuild London was lost, and as we've discussed before, Christopher Wren, Hawksmoor's master, was not at all happy about this. What did happen, and I want to come back to this quote, is Charles II very quickly removed the monopoly on the worshipful company of Masons to rebuild after the Great Fire. He said, look, there's just too much work for you guys to do, to handle by yourself. So I'm going to remove your monopoly. And they weren't happy about that, because they'd have quite happily, I'm sure, recruited more people into their guild to get the work done. But that wasn't what happened. Really, I always love this fact. I mean, Masons came from all over the world to London because it was just suddenly the biggest building project ever, rebuilding a whole town. It's not a castle, it's not a cathedral, it's a whole town. And there's one Mason at least whose mark you find on the Taj Mahal, apparently, as well as St. Paul's. So some guy got, some Mason somewhere had it on his CV. Yeah, I worked on the Taj Mahal, then I came to St. Paul's Cathedral. I think it must have been that way around. So Masons came from Europe, Masons came from all over, and they were no longer members of the worshipful company of Masons that lived in this, that existed in the city, that seemed to have these Whig associations. This is all paid for by a tax on coal, and all the work, really, the royal work, came via Christopher Wren. So if you weren't a friend of Christopher Wren, you weren't getting much work. So this opportunity to recruit honest artificers was a chance to recruit Masons from all over the world, operative stonecutters, and recruit them into a hierarchy around Wren and the Scottish Rite Freemasonry that he was part of, and not the older Irish Rite Freemasonry, which seems to be associated with the worshipful company that existed in the city. The work of the Irish Rite, you could say, goes all the way back to the Gothic cathedrals, those amazing buildings. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more. Again, I didn't know anything about this until I saw Hawksmoor, read about Hawksmoor. And this was Westminster Abbey. These spires look medieval, but they're not. They're really, really quite recent. They were built by Hawksmoor and completed in about 1730s. But he deliberately made them look old school, old, Gothic. He made them look Gothic. It was a part of his design brief. And he pointed out in his correspondence to the people who were paying him, he didn't like Gothic. He thought it was unchristian, and he kind of said so. What he said was interesting, and it will unpick a bit of history for us. The sharp-pointed arches, Wren said, this manner of building, Mr. Evelyn and Sir Christopher Wren and other regular artists believes was brought by the Saracens in the Holy War by some of the curious at the time. And he actually, Wren, in his letter, put curious with a capital C. I mean, if you remember, like, Masonry was called the curious science. So what he's saying there is Gothic architecture came back from the Middle East in the Crusades and was brought back by some of the curious. And it's taken me, it's 15 years ago, maybe more, I read that sentence first, and it's taken me a while to understand what it really meant. The Gothic architecture, he was saying, was basically Islamic in origin, and therefore unfit for Christianity. And they made this point again and again. Wren really didn't like the Gothic architecture and the tradition that embodied. And they literally said, if you go into a church like this, or if you build a church like this, you're more influenced by Islam than you are by Christianity. You're not a proper Christian. And they got very po-faced about it. Therefore, they could say that, and they did say, the Irish Rite, with its understanding and its practices, was polluted with non-Christian elements, which are alien, foreign, and suspect. Cathedrals are Saracenic. And this is true, because actually Gothic arches did come from the Middle East. They built them first. They built spires, minarets, whatever, before they were built in Europe. They knew all about stained glass. Technology was far in advance. People brought that back from the Crusades. Same with building domes, same with mathematics, same with medicine, so many ways that the Muslim world were ahead of the European world. So it's no wonder that there was some kind of information download. And as it turned out, that information download, at least in part, ended up with the Gothic cathedrals being made. So whatever was transmitted, it seems to me, was a good thing. I think those Gothic cathedrals are amazing. But it's incontrovertible fact that you could have books and books on this, but really Gothic architecture is Islamic or Muslim, Middle Eastern in origin and influence. I've practiced a lot of Sufi ritual. It's basically a form of meditation, and it's similar to how I described the Freemasonry stuff earlier, in that if you participate in one of these, I'm going to say kind of for me, this was completely secular, but it's like a hokey cokey that you do for a couple of hours where you sing and stuff in Arabic, movements and words, and you catch little bits as you go along. As you go along every week and practice this stuff, even though I'm not an Arabic speaker, I could pick up phrases and so on. And over time, I could probably have recited the whole thing to you, even though I didn't know what 90% of it meant. This was a series of rituals that I participated in that are broadly called Sufi. The guy, Jalaluddin Rumi, who set up the whirling dervishes, him. It's well established that in the Muslim world, there are these guys called Sufis who participated in practices that were focused on personal development. The explorer Sir Richard Burton said Sufism was the English parent of Freemasonry. I'd also say that I once chatted to a guy who was an architect who was a Freemason, and I said to him about the origins of it all and what he thought, and he straight away pointed me to this book, The Sufis by Idris Shah, that I had already read at the time, but this is roughly what this book says about the origins of Freemasonry. You can see here the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. It's an incredible building if you ever get to go. It's incredibly blue, as you might have noticed, and after a while, it's quite an effect the blue has on you. It is very intense. That's Richard Burton there. That's the temple in London, built famously by the Templars. The number of connections between, the amount of exchange between the Templars especially and the Muslim world is, again, very, very well recorded. It's not quite as clear as that Palladian thing in Italy to that Palladian thing in Kew, but there's a very clear architectural and other sort of chain of transmission between the Muslim world and the Templars and later the Masons especially. Couple of facts. A guy called Robert of Chester, who was called Robert and was from Chester, was the person who introduced alchemy into Europe. He did that because he'd studied in the most sophisticated universities in the world at the time, which were in Spain under the Muslims, the Saracens. It's a matter of fact that certain Masons, Freemasons, even today, use certain code words. And, you can look these things up on the internet if you're interested. But these code words are derived from Arabic. That is, if you try and understand them in any other sense, they're gobbledygook. But if you look at them as through the lens of Arabic grammar, they make sense. So clearly, Arabic influence. People point out the importance of Arabic grammar. It's a very big subject, but Arabic is a very, very, very ancient language, much more ancient than modern Hebrew, and it plays an incredible part in the grammar of Arabic, and has played an incredible role in the grammars of our imagination, how ideas are connected, very deeply influenced by Arabic grammar, and because of what their influence in the Middle Ages. In Masonic rituals, some of their postures and so on have Arabic origins. And really, if you want to boil it down, I'll try and be quick. There's this guy, Dulnun, who set up a group, a band of guys called the Builders, who kind of became known as the Carbonari, or when they spread out their practices, became known as the Carbonari in Italy, and the Coleman. They're, for various reasons, blackface, but this is going back to the 8th century, like black being associated with knowledge and understanding and wisdom. Schwarzkopf in Germany, meaning blackhead, literally means wise. There are all these grammars that I'm talking about, but essentially the Builders, this group of Sufis that started in the 9th century, became incredibly influential, and they did do some of their meditation, some of their spiritual practicing by cutting stone. That was literally what they did day to day. In the same way as, or in a way that I'm sure you'll see is very similar to Freemasonry, they'd always refer to each other as brothers. They did consider themselves as a bit of an elect. They weren't just anyone. They wanted to try and set an example through their conduct and so on. And it was all about personal development. They were about trying to be better Sufis, better Muslims, better people. And this is really where the Freemasonry, if you like, it's the head, it's the source of the Freemasonry river as it comes into this story in London in the 17th century. The Templars, as is well known, were accused of Saracenic leanings or being pro-Muslim or this, that, and the other, and were eventually disbanded. It's kind of well understood that there was kind of the Templars sort of morphed slowly into the Freemasons, or there's a lot of crossover there. There is an order in the Freemasonic hierarchy called the Order of the Knights of the Temple or something like that. There's a good deal of crossover between it all. It's all a bit messy, but it is all to do with spirituality and imagination. So there's no formula here, but clearly the origin of the Irish Freemasonry that we've been talking about, the ones that built the amazing cathedrals, does have an Islamic influence. And this was used by people like Wren and Hawksmoor to kind of just be snobby about it and say it wasn't Christian enough. Again, I didn't know about any of this, the Scottish Rite, the Irish Rite, this, that, and the other, until I read about this, because this is Henry Sacheverell, and it was his speech that I'm about to explain to you now that just made it clear to me what was going on at the time with the politics. His speech was credited for causing a sensation that brought the Tories back into government, and it was the Tory government in 1710 and 1711 that made the 50 Churches Act that Hawksmoor got to build his churches from. And Hawksmoor and everyone at the time were aware that this Tory government was in real jeopardy. They felt very persecuted, this Tory government, and Hawksmoor and his friends did as well. But there's a really interesting history to it, because on November the 5th every year at St Paul's Cathedral, someone would give a speech celebrating November the 5th as the day that the gunpowder plot was discovered and the day that the Glorious Revolution happened in 1688. William of Orange had been clever enough to come and invade the country on November the 5th, 1688, to remind everyone that he was a Protestant trying to save them from Catholics. So November the 5th for 100 years or so had been celebrated as a day where we were delivered, saved from the Catholics. And every year there was a sermon at St Paul's Cathedral to celebrate this. So in 1709, this guy, Henry Sacheverell, made this speech. He was well known to be a Tory. And apparently before he gave this speech, people could see him sort of whipping himself up into a bit of a frenzy. This was a big gig for this guy. This is like the national stage. So he stood up on stage. You've got to imagine all the grand people in the city of London, all the Whigs were there. This is a Whig event they'd held every year in St Paul's Cathedral, which was just finished. This was him on the national stage, Henry Sacheverell. He said that basically the people who did the gunpowder plot were fanatics and deserved to die, but so had been the people who killed Charles I. They were fanatics and deserved to die as well. That meant that half the people in the audience, the Whigs in the audience he was talking to, who had been implicated in the execution of Charles I or had profited by any of the Whigs, were as bad as the gunpowder plotters. And this was just an absolutely explosive and inflammatory thing to say. So to give you a direct quote, "Rage and bloodthirstiness of both popish and fanatic enemies of our church and government. These two," so the people who blew up the gunpowder plotters and the executors of Charles I, "these 2 days indeed are but one united proof and visible testimonial of the same dangerous and rebellious principles in confederates in iniquity maintain." He's trying to say the Catholics were nutters, but so were the Whigs, so were the Puritans. They're all as bad as each other because they're all fanatics. This spurious and villain, he's now talking about equality and freedom of religion, anything to do with equality, right? Where you're not part of the Church of England and the church militant. This spurious and villainous notion, which will take in Jews, Quakers, and Mohammedans as anything as as well as Christians. So he was deeply against this notion of equality, which was a big part of the Whig, offer. We can have different churches, we can have different religions. Hey man, let's all just hang out. He was railing against that. And last, he said the church militant must fight against principalities, against powers, against rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. The battle would be hard, accepted, because her adversaries are chief and our enemies at present prosper. So basically the Church of England is overwhelmed by enemies on all sides, and it's up to people to stand up to fanatics like the gunpowder plotters and fanatics like the Whigs who executed the king. This is incredibly divisive, and deliberately so. The Whigs were doing very well at the time, were sitting pretty, had the ascendancy, and had basically annoyed a lot of people and alienated a lot of people. They were the party of modernity, and anyone who wasn't profiting from that modernity had a reason to feel a bit aggrieved, because after all, change just kept on happening and people were a bit, let's say, tired out with all the politics. But specifically, I got this quote, which will take in Jews, Quakers and Mohammedans. He's saying it's either the Church of England or it's no church at all, like conformity or nothing. And that was really the Tory offer, going back to the way it had been. So perils of false brethren. This was literally what his speech was called. The perils of having brothers who are false. Copies of this speech were sent to every parish church in the country, and it was read out. That means there were about 9,000 copies sent out to every parish church. It was read out. It caused a sensation wherever it went. It actually eventually got printed, they reckon, about 100,000 copies, which is just completely unprecedented. No one had ever, maybe the Bible, do you know what I mean? But no one had ever printed anything like this in quite so many copies. No, it become a real cause celeb. Everyone was talking about it. And again, he was really, you could say, the first person created a celebrity by the media. Lots of people pointing this out. After this speech, in the years following, he'd go around, specifically when there were elections going on, he'd go around and whip everyone up into a sort of righteous indignation. They go off, have some, drink in a pub, sing some patriotic songs, and all Ballywell vote Tory in the morning kind of thing. He was a celebrity. He'd go around the home counties, especially, often followed by thousands of people going, hey, good for you, Henry. And he was a celebrity. So famous, in fact, because he was so critical of the Whig government that was in power at the time. The House of Commons decided to put him on trial. That was between the 27th of February and the 21st of March. The House of Commons to try to accuse him, but he was actually defended by people in the House of Lords, and he was acquitted. Later that year, Sackeville riots took place in London and the rest of the country. Basically, anywhere that was a bit different, anywhere where there was a dissenting, a Quaker, a fifth monarchist, if you were any of these kind of strange, non-Church of England, non-conformist, non-Tory kind of churches, you were likely to get attacked. So there was a deliberate othering of people. He was deliberately trying to say, these people aren't British enough for Britain, sort of thing. They're not Tory enough for us, in that way that we're all very familiar with. Eventually, these Sackeville riots, as they were called, some of them were clearly organised, were kind of going around picking on centres of dissent or centres of non-conformity. And it seemed like someone had a pretty thorough list. In each area, people would go around and make sure the right people got beaten up and the right things got broken. These Sackeville riots actually, eventually, when the Whigs got back in power, forced them to create the Riot Act, which meant it was illegal for 12 people to get together, because it just got, the Whigs were so unpopular and these riots were really kicking off that they actually made it, I forgot when the Riot Act, I think it was in the 1960s, but between 1714, when the Riot Act was signed, and the 1960s, it was illegal, or the police could arrest groups of over 12. And that's all because of Henry Sackeville whipping up this frenzy. As I said, went around on quite a systemic and horrible basis, burning down places that looked different. Catholics also had a hard time. Anyone that wasn't, dyed in the wool Tory, kind of thing. And this phenomenon is credited with sweeping the Tories into election in 1710. And actually, if you wanted to do a proper analysis of all of this, or a much longer chat about this, you'd see it was all really orchestrated by a guy called Robert Harley, who became the chief minister of Queen Anne. People say Robert Walpole was the first prime minister. Robert Harley, who was just before Walpole, was also the prime minister. And the reason I know about all of this was because this government led to the 1711 Churches Act, which was Hawksmoor's attempt to build 50 churches across London and impose Tory rule and these kind of Anglican conservative churches across London. Hawksmoor was a big fan of Henry Sackeville, and he were on the same page about this. You need conformist churches, proper Tory religion, and this was all part of the same movement. Robert Harley, the political operator, was orchestrating a sort of nostalgia for proper old school religion for political purposes. So you got this Scottish Rite in the form of the Tories moving around and expanding their sphere of influence. As a matter of history, the Scottish Rite and the Irish Rite existed or coexisted as rivals for quite a while. In the USA, you could say it was mainly the Irish Rite and Whigs, and in the UK, you could say it was mainly Scottish and Tory. And in 1812, they had a war, because the British kept on treating America like it was still a colony, essentially. Sometime during this war, during the time of this war, the two grand lodges of the Irish Rite and the Scottish Rite got together in England, apparently 27th of December 1813, and that made the United Grand Lodge of England. And that deal, whoever it was between, made the Scottish Rite more senior than the Irish Rite. So in precedence, the Scottish Rite was more important. The claimed precedence of the Scottish Rite was actually from the lodge, the Grand Lodge, that was formed on June the 24th, 1717, and that was with Wren and Hawksmoor present. That's the original Grand Lodge the Scottish Rite claims to come from. So that's 1717, but I've shown you 100 years before that, there was the Indigo Jones Rite. That about over 100 years before that, that thing I showed you, all those words had been written down and memorized repeatedly by Masons. So obviously there was another Masonic order that predates the Scottish Rite. It had an egalitarian revolutionary agenda and has been sidelined, marginalized, and sort of extracted from our history. So you see in the Civil War, these amazing works of political maneuvering with these petitions. Well, nowadays we're told that all just happened organically. No one was organizing it. There was no such thing as the leveller party. It seems to me that actually what was happening was something along the lines of what was now known as Irish Rite Freemasonry, worked to organize aspects of the political campaigning during the Civil War, especially to do with equality. And that's been removed from our history. Those efforts, those concerted efforts by guys like people like John Lilburn, Thomas Rainsborough, they were working together in a concerted effort to try and increase the prosperity of most people. And now we're told they don't exist. Because I think it's a common thing if you look at English history, whenever someone's, well, look what happened to Coleman. I mean, it's not a secret. People who advocate for equality aren't popular with the powers that be. This is now the United Grand Lodge of England, and where Freemasonry says it came from. Or this is you could say that. But I've shown you, and it is pretty obvious that Freemasonry pre-existed this version that Sir Robert Murray got initiated to in 1641 and made its Grand Lodge in 1717. You can see, if you go back and look in detail at that Igo Jones Charge, he talks about the history of Masonry in this country from the year 300, I think. There's a long history of it, and it was clearly organized, and they had a history, and they had these rituals and so on that long predated 1717 for, I think, political reasons. All of that history, all of our history that pertains to that movement has been removed. It does make me wonder, because you see sometimes old pictures of trade union movements and trade union meetings, and they'd use badges and handshakes and code words and insignia and regalia to make their point. And I can't help but thinking that there's something about the trade union movement that was similar, at least in inspiration, or similar at least in intent, in that they're trying to organize for equality. And I'd say whether it's the London Jewish Bakers Union union of general workers or whoever, people were aware of the power of coming together and having shared interests and, actioning those together against the powerful. And obviously, that's obviously something that the powerful don't particularly like. So the Irish Rite in Freemasonry has been sort of demoted in their own terms to something a little bit less important than the Scottish Rite. And I think it's clear from my point of view that after the Great Fire, there was, if you like, a takeover. The traditional Masonic guilds who, had something to do with the building of the churches in the Middle Ages and had been in the building game for centuries were kind of, that organization was denuded of money. They weren't given any of the royal works, and a new organization around Christopher Wren was built up. And that's how Irish Rite Masonry, which is more Whig, got replaced with Scottish Rite Masonry, which is more Tory. And why Masonry today is such a disappointment, because you could be like the Jedi, but they've been like the Sith instead. There were people out there fighting the good fight at one point under the banner of Freemasonry, and maybe they are still, but they're doing it very quietly as far as I can see. And that really clarified something for me, because I was always clear that the guys who'd participated in the American Revolution, say, or built those cathedrals, who were both free, were pretty cool. They seemed pretty cool to me. I can understand why Freemasonry in this country was such a conservative and inward-looking thing. It's because of, I would say, because of what I've just described, the fact that the Scottish Rite Freemasons outmaneuvered the Irish Rite Freemasons and took over the building work, not just in London, but eventually all over the place.